given my talk the title of the Gregory option. Some here may recognize the allusion to the more widely recognized and controversial Benedict option, popularized by conservative journalist Rod Dreher. Dreher proposes a strategic retreat in the face of what he and many others see as an increasingly intolerant secularism. His argument has little to do with the actual Benedict, as he admits, but is a riff on a phrase at the end of Alistair MacIntyre's important book, After Virtue. And many others have in turn riffed on Dreher's option, producing alternative options for how Christians should engage in what some call a post-Christian West. These options, however, came out in a flurry before the 2017 election, and it would be an understatement to say that things have changed a little since then. Those who once feared encroaching liberalism, theological or political, are now seemingly triumphalistic, even if they don't like Trump. As a friend of mine put it, I don't like him, but I have heard more people tell me Merry Christmas this year than previously. If Dreher saw Benedict as a paradigm for how to preserve the integrity of Christian faith in the coming dark ages of antagonistic secularism, then who might be a model for the kind of political whiplash that we are currently experiencing? My area of study is the early church, and usually when people discuss politics and the early church, they look to Eusebius and Augustine as paradigmatic of two different approaches toward politics. The former being seen as the foundations for so-called Caesaropapism, the marriage of church and state, or the overused Constantinianism, prominent in the Christian East, while the latter is seen as the foundation of the typical Western paradigm of the two cities, or two kingdoms, which set the church and state in a complicated and contested dance. Seldom, if ever, do people consider the thought of Gregory of Nazianzus in such questions. This is perhaps for two reasons. The first is that Gregory's corpus does not easily lend itself to systematic analysis of political thought. And second, it has been too easy to subsume him under the paradigm of the Eusebian model. However, I think we can learn much from Gregory for our current political situation for two reasons. First, Gregory lived at a time of intense political change. Shortly before he was born, Constantine became a Christian, made Christianity a legal religion, and became the sole ruler of the empire. Christianity's relationship to Rome was irrevocably changed, for good or for ill. Shortly after Constantine came to power, he convened the Council of Nicaea in 325, where the doctrine of the Trinity was proclaimed to be the Christian doctrine of God, against the so-called Arians. Even so, in the years following Nicaea, it was Arianism that gained the upper hand, especially under the rule of Constantine's son, Constantius, who fully supported the Arians at a council in 360. Yet all of this was to change with the ascension of Julian, who left the Christianity of his youth and sought to bring the empire back to the Greco-Roman gods. Julian's reign, however, was cut short when he was killed on campaign against the Persians in 363. In the years that followed, the Arianizing policy of Constantius more or less prevailed until 379, with the ascension of Theodosius to the imperial throne. In hindsight, we know that Theodosius, who ruled from Constantinople in the east, and the emperors Gratian and Valentinian II, who ruled from Rome in the west, would issue the Edict of Thessalonica on February 27, 380, making Trinitarian Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. But for Gregory, who had recently moved to Constantinople to rhetorically combat the dominant Neo-Arian presence there, he did not know what Theodosius would do. From Gregory's perspective, he was the underdog, fighting the good fight in defense of the faith with all of his oratorical might. Suddenly then, Gregory is no longer the underdog, and not only has the emperor joined his side, but, and this is the second reason why Gregory is relevant, Gregory is chosen by the emperor to be the bishop of Constantinople, and for a short while, the president of the Council of Constantinople in 381. This is no small accomplishment. Such an appointment is more than a job. It is a symbol of Theodosius' leadership style. Gregory was more or less the mouth of Theodosius. And if you're interested in this, I would highly recommend Susanna Elm's book, Sons of Hellenism, Fathers of the Church, where she explores in great detail Gregory in this regard by comparing him to Julian, their ideas about political leadership, the role of religion, and the vision of Rome. These details do not immediately concern me here. What I want to focus on is how Gregory suddenly shifts from ideological minority to courting imperial favor, from outside the palace to the proverbial right hand of the emperor. It is for these reasons that I think Gregory can speak to our current situation. How are Christians to respond to the significant cultural shift marked by the Trump presidency? His use of Christianity to bolster support from among evangelical, Catholic, and Orthodox Christian, and yes, it wasn't only Protestant evangelicals who voted for Trump, and sometimes tied with this coalition of Christians and the Trump presidency, the rising sense of nationalism. What does it mean to be a Christian citizen in America in 2018? But before I talk about Gregory, I want to make a qualification. While I think there are many interesting parallels between contemporary America and the Roman Empire, we must resist the temptation to flatten out the significant differences between Gregory's time and our own. The Roman Empire in late antiquity was not a nation state. The nation state did not develop until the modern period, and it would be anachronistic to read nationalism as we know it back into late antiquity. Now, there are weak and strong versions of nationalism. Excuse me. The conservative philosopher Roger Scruton promotes what might be considered a weak nationalism. What makes the nation state so important in Scruton's view is that what unifies a people is not a religion or an ethnicity, but a land. By making land central, Scruton thinks we are able to be bound together in community with people of different ethnicities and religions. What we fight for when we fight for the nation is not our race or our religion, but our neighborhoods that we share with one another. This can be contrasted with a stronger view of nationalism. Oliver O'Donovan sees strong nationalism tied to the question of identity. The strong nationalist is, he says, a conservative who has lost his faith, for whom the sense of identity is no longer given immediately and on the surface of things, but must be received from the depths in which it has been buried. Perhaps here on the question of identity, we may find one point of contact between contemporary nationalism and Greco-Romanism. This is clear in the debate between Julian and Gregory over who has the right to Greco-Roman culture. Julian thinks that the salvation of the empire is tied to a return to the Greco-Roman gods, whose worship has been compromised by the policies of Constantine and especially Constantius, and their devotion to the god of the, what he calls, Galileans. That is, Julian seeks a recovery for what is lost. Gregory was caught up in Julian's program, and it had a significant effect on him and his thought. What does it mean to be a Christian in the Roman Empire? What does it mean for the Roman Empire to suddenly become officially Christian? And where is the church in all of this? In what follows, I want to highlight what Gregory sees as vital for Christian identity in the Roman Empire, and what we can learn as Christians in America today. To do so, I will focus on 5 virtues that Gregory sees as important to Christian citizenship, namely, retreat, education, philanthropy, appropriate resistance, and the proper celebration of public festivals. For Gregory, virtue is necessary for the health of any community, inside and outside of the church. For example, one of Gregory's orations is an appeal to a tax collector who was reassessing the taxes of his city. On the one hand, Gregory calls his audience to be subject to paying taxes. He appeals to the paradigm of Jesus paying the temple tax in Matthew 17, and if they wish to honor Christ, they should do the same. At first, this sounds merely like a call to the status quo. Yet, Gregory also calls the tax collector to act justly, because he says these injunctions apply to everyone, not just to those in authority. Moral disease is common to all, and its treatment is the same for all. A question I have often seen being asked by Christians is whether or not the relationship to political power is one of maintaining the status quo or resisting. Of course, the answer to that question often changes depending on who is in power and whether I think they are my ideological friend or foe. Gregory, I think, would find this to be the wrong question. Maintaining the status quo or resisting political power is not the cause of, but the result of cultivating virtue. So what virtues do we cultivate as Christian citizens? The first virtue that Gregory thinks is necessary for Christian citizenship is strategic retreat. Gregory has become infamous for running away from responsibility. When his father ordained him as a priest in Nazianzus, Gregory runs away to visit his friend Basil in Pontus, which is on the northern Turkey by the Black Sea. He pens his oration, too, in defense of his flight. However, as Susanna Elm has shown in her book, Sons of Hellenism, Fathers of the Church, what Gregory is doing is actually locating himself within a long-standing debate in antiquity about how those in leadership positions balance the active and the contemplative life. Gregory thinks both are important. One must not rush headlong into a leadership role. Indeed, only those suffering from great hubris are eager for such positions. One must retreat for a time to cultivate the virtues necessary for engaging in the active and public life upon returning from retreat. In the midst of talk about whether Christians should retreat from the public sphere, Gregory offers a yes and a no. Retreat is not merely for the benefit of oneself. Though it is easy for us to see retreat as merely getting a break from the chaos of everyday life, Gregory reminds us that a break from normal life is an opportunity to be transformed by God for the benefit of those who are in our communities. Like a well-trained soul that transforms the body, bringing it under control and subjecting it to virtue, so the soul that goes in retreat is equipped to enter back into communal life and do the same. Perhaps here there is a similarity between what Gregory thinks and what Dreher has promoted. Though, again, Dreher wrote under the assumption of the triumphalistic march of liberalism under the assumed presidential victory of Hillary Clinton, which has given his writings on this subject a pessimistic veneer. Gregory's view of retreat, however, draws on the long philosophical debate between the active and contemplative life, which he held to both in the shadow of Julian and Theodosius. It was to him a universal principle of good leadership to balance the active and contemplative life, to retreat and to come back into the community. The second virtue that Gregory thinks is necessary for Christian citizens is education. Gregory loved his education. As the son of provincial elites, Gregory was given a world-class education for his day. After local grammar studies, Gregory studied rhetoric in Caesarea in Cappadocia. From there, he studied abroad in Caesarea Palestine and Alexandria for a couple years before moving on to his greatest love, Athens. At Athens, Gregory studied rhetoric for 10 years under the tutelage of both pagan and Christian rhetoric teachers. It is also here that Gregory formed one of his most important and tumultuous friendships with Basil of Caesarea. Compared to Basil, it is surprising to see Gregory speak so lovingly of his time in Athens. He loved everything about it: the language, the education, the culture. His love for this education spurred him to write a harsh posthumous response to the Emperor Julian's edict, banning Christians from teaching the Greek classics. One of his longest writings, Oration 4, vigorously argues that Greek literature does not belong only to those who believe in the Greek gods, just because they are written in Greek. Instead, the true word, logos, who is the source of our words, logi, has given language, culture, and education for the sake of building up human communities, regardless of who invented it. All the products of culture belong to all, to be used for the sake of all. But we must not forget, however, that Gregory is speaking about education from within a highly paganized educational context. It is not easily Christianized. Yet still he fights for the right to the best of Greece that Greece has to offer, and he makes it his own. An education, even one that might be considered tainted by pagan thought, could still be claimed by Gregory as the right of all citizens, Christian, pagan, or something else. The third virtue Gregory thinks is necessary for Christian citizenship is philanthropy. Gregory sees philanthropy as the highest virtue a Christian can have. In part, this is not uncommon for his day. A rhetorician might praise someone for their philanthropy as a summary of all the classical virtues: prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. He argues vigorously in Oration 14 on the love of the poor, which he wrote to elicit support for Basil's effort to care for the sick and poor by building hostels outside of Caesarea. There he argues for the ideal of philanthropy. However, Gregory did not merely see this as a human ideal. He sees philanthropy as the virtue most perfectly expressed by God, who in his great love for humanity became incarnate, suffered, and died. Indeed, philanthropy, Gregory thinks, is the virtue that makes us most like God. Their efforts, Gregory and Basil's effort, seems to have been a success. For what began as mere hostels had burgeoned into a new city called Basileus by some in honor of Basil who had started it. Gregory put to good use the years of rhetorical education. His powers of persuasion are on full display as he moves the hearts and hands of those who hear to see the plight of those in need and to do something about it. As the highest virtue, philanthropy imitates what God has done in saving humanity, and Gregory and his friends put that into action in caring for the poor. The fourth virtue Gregory thinks is necessary for Christian citizenship is a certain kind of resistance to those in authority. While Gregory is more than willing to affirm the need for citizens to abide by the laws of the land, he is also willing to criticize those in leadership. He does this with the Emperor Julian, as I already discussed, and after he was pushed out from the presidency of the Council of Constantinople by ecclesial machinations, he wrote scathing works against his fellow bishops. But there is one thing you must be aware of, I assure you, Gregory writes in one of his poems: bad bishops. Don't be overawed by the dignity of the throne. All have the dignity, yes, but not all have the grace. Discard the outer clothing, watch for the wolf. Words do not convince me, I must have deeds. But perhaps the most famous example comes from Gregory's funeral oration for his friend Basil. There he relates a story of Basil confronting a prefect. Then indeed the prefect became excited and rose from his seat, boiling with rage and making use of harsher language. "What?" he said, have you no fear of my authority?" "Fear of what?" said Basil. "How could it affect me?" "Of what? Of any one of the resources of my power?" "What are these?" said Basil. "Pray inform me. Confiscation, banishment, torture, death. Have you no other threat?" Said he, "For none of these can reach me." "How indeed is that?" said the prefect. "Because," he replied, "a man who has nothing is beyond the reach of confiscation, unless you demand my tattered rags and the few books which are my only possessions. Banishment is impossible for me, who am confined by no limit of place, counting my own neither the land where I now dwell, nor all of that into which I may be hurled, or rather counting it all God's, whose guest and dependent I am. As for tortures, what hold can they have upon one whose body has ceased to be? Unless you mean the first stroke, for this alone is in your power. Death is my benefactor, for it will send me the sooner to God, for whom I live and exist and have all but died, and to whom I have long been hastening." Amazed at this language, the prefect said, "No one has ever spoken thus, and with such boldness to Modestus." "Why, perhaps," said Basil, "you have not met with a bishop." Or in his defense of such interest, he would have used precisely the same language. For we are modest in general and submissive to everyone, according to the precept of our laws. We may not treat with haughtiness even an ordinary person, to say nothing of so great a potentate. But where the interests of God are at stake, we care for nothing else, and make these our sole object. Fire and sword and wild beasts and rakes which tear the flesh, we revel in, and fear them not. You may further insult and threaten us, and do whatever you will, to the full extent of your power. The emperor himself may hear this, that neither by violence nor persuasion will you bring us to make common cause with impiety, not even though your threats become still more terrible. Here, Gregory relates a story about Basil that serves as a paradigm to be imitated. Funeral orations were not merely recounting of a person's life. In classical rhetoric, funeral orations were as much about the audience as in how they are to live as they were about the deceased. So when Gregory chooses to share a story of Basil resisting a prefect, it is not because he merely thinks it is an interesting story. Instead, Gregory shares the story of Basil because he thinks that it is proper for a bishop to resist political authority when necessary. But here we must be careful. Gregory does not think of resistance in the same way we do. He would not organize a protest, sit-ins, marches, or any of the other options we see commonly as acts of resistance. For Gregory, Basil can resist because of his place within a larger institution, both in the church, he is a bishop, but also within the larger culture, namely as someone trained in rhetoric. A training in rhetoric was not merely learning how to speak well, but involved learning how a man of letters functions in society. Orators were essential features of public life, whether it was giving orations at public festivals or fulfilling the role of a lawyer, for there were very few actual legal experts in antiquity. Here perhaps we can see a difficulty for our own contemporary situation. What cultural institution do we have that can span all of these spheres? It seems to me that resistance will become flat, merely an attempt at overpowering my ideological foe, if we do not have the kind of mediating cultural institutions that were available to Gregory. It is not enough that one speaks truth to power, but one must have the authority to do so. If I were in an orchestra and I looked up from my music to see two people flailing their arms about, one up on stage and the other in the audience, I am not at a loss for whom to follow. The person in the audience has no authority over me, but the conductor does. And it is the cultural institution of the orchestra that allows the conductor to have and exercise that authority. It seems to me that sometimes our current attitudes toward resistance are like the audience member flailing their arms and wondering why the orchestra is not following their lead. To resist, one must speak truth to power with the proper authority. And that requires the appropriate cultural institution from which one can speak. Gregory has that cultural institution of an orator. What do we have in contemporary America? Finally, I want to talk about one last virtue that Gregory would see as necessary for Christian citizenship, and that is the proper celebration of public festivals. Public festivals were an integral part of Greco-Roman culture, and indeed public celebrations have never ceased being integral for any culture. How many here gathered together with friends or know someone who did to watch the Super Bowl? How many of you are buying chocolates or flowers today for that special someone? These are what philosopher James K. Smith calls cultural liturgies. They are the rituals that shape the way we think, act, feel, and most importantly for Smith, what we love. Similarly, Greco-Roman festivals shaped good citizens of Rome. Many times in Gregory's corpus, he contrasts Greek festivals with Christian ones. In his second oration against the Emperor Julian, Gregory says, "First, therefore, brethren, let us keep a festival, not with cheerfulness of face, nor changes in sumptuousness of apparel, nor with revelings and drunkenness, the fruit whereof you have been taught is chambering and wantonness, Neither let us crown the streets with flowers, nor our tables with the scandal of perfumes, nor let us decorate the entrances of our dwellings. Neither let our houses be illuminated with the material light, nor resounding with concerts and the clapping of hands, for this is the pride of a heathen festivity. But let not us glorify God or celebrate the present occasion with such things as these, wherewith it is not fitting, but rather with purity of soul, in cheerfulness of temper, and with the lamps of the church that illuminate the body. I mean with godly contemplations and thoughts raised aloft upon the sacred lampstand, and diffusing a light over all the world. Compared to such a light, I esteem as mere trifle all that men light up when they hold festivals. Note that Gregory does not deny public festivals altogether, but the manner in which they are celebrated. And at first blush, one might think that this is convenient for Gregory to criticize public festivals from the outside in the context of Julian's reign. But he maintains this attitude even when he is the bishop of Constantinople, and Christianity is the official religion of the empire. In Oration 38, he says, "But let us leave these things to the Greeks and Greek flamboyance and festivities, who call gods those who delight in the odor of burnt offerings, and correspondingly worship the gods with their stomachs. Being wicked, they are shown to be sculptors and priests and initiates of wicked demons. We, on the other hand, for whom the word is that which is worshipped, if some must live luxuriously, let them live luxuriously in the word, and in the divine law and narratives, both in all the others and the narrative from which is this present feast, in order that our luxury might be proper and not foreign to the one who has called us together." This is said at the Feast of the Incarnation, that is, his Christmas sermon. I think the movement by some Christians to take back Christmas from the over-commercialization of the holiday is an appropriate analog for what Gregory is getting at. And to be clear, I'm not talking about making sure people say Merry Christmas to us. Festivals can play a powerful role in constructing cultural identity. And so Christian citizens need not abstain from public festivals, but must celebrate them properly. This could perhaps offer an interesting opportunity for Christians to both shape culture inside and outside of the church. What if, for instance, Christians spent Christmas giving gifts to the poor instead of the many unnecessary gifts we tend to give each other? How might the broader culture change if more Christians properly celebrated Christmas? And in conclusion, Christian civic identity is not something lost that needs to be recovered. It is a virtue that needs to be cultivated. I've argued that for Gregory, the particular virtues that need to be cultivated are retreat, education, philanthropy, appropriate resistance, and the proper celebration of public festivals. A Christian can only be a nationalist in a weak sense, as someone who is called to love their neighbors. I do not say the neighbor as if Christ's command was to love an abstract concept. We are called to love our neighbor, those with whom we have regular contact, whose lives are tied up with our own. But a strong nationalism which seeks to recover some lost identity, racial, cultural, or religious, has confused cause for effect. It is only by cultivating the virtues of retreat, education, philanthropy, appropriate resistance, and the proper celebration of festivals that a Christian civic identity can be formed. Thank you.